Hey, Brussell. I'm in Carmel, California, and it's broadcast number 547, May 30th, 1982. I had a shock this week. It was quite a surprise because it came with absolutely no warning. And I got a call, I was in Los Angeles, from the station manager at KLRB. The show was canceled. I've been on there 11 years, and the station was sold about 2 months ago, and the last station manager left 3 or 4 weeks ago, and the business salesman and a new team came in. And about 3 weeks ago, the woman who was in charge of the station was there to greet me, and she was very friendly, and she knew me from doing shows with Victor Bach up at KOMY. And I said, well, how many heads are falling around here? And she said, oh, your show is great. It's wonderful. We want to do some promos. It's very positive. And they were very friendly, and the station was reorganizing its format somewhat, and everything was fine. The next week, it was very friendly, and it was really good, and there wasn't any doubt in my mind, how they were feeling. And I went in last week, and the person who put on the show for me, the tapes and so forth, wanted me to mention a subject I'd be doing the following week so that they could put a spot on the air. So there came absolutely as there was no warning about what was happening. I went to Los Angeles and got a call Friday saying that the show wouldn't be on this week because they were going to have a series of music, the top 500, and then Saturday, station manager called and said, no more KLRB. In a way, it was a terrible shock, and on the other hand, I kind of was expecting it. I don't know if there's any relationship to the event, but I had a visitor here Friday night, and it was something, again, I wasn't expecting. It was somebody who had been high up in government. It was staying at the Navy postgraduate school. The whole thing was disconcerting, and I don't know if it had anything to do with the quick way that this was dropped or not. I can't put it together yet because it all happened this weekend, and the station for the holidays is really not functioning. So it'll take a week or maybe never to really know the relationship of the cause and effect if somebody just said, get her off the air there. I really have no way of knowing except that I had some uneasy feelings that I don't want to put on the air about this person and what happened and the conversations and so forth. I don't want to get tangled at that level. So we'll just say that KLRB is over. There was another station in town that had asked me, one of the directors there that puts on the broadcast, it said, if ever you're not at KLRB, let me know. That's K-Ocean is the station. And so I called him, and he said he would call back during the week. The man who owns the station, again, isn't there over Memorial Day weekend. So we have to wait and see if I'll be on K-Ocean or not, but it came as quite a shock, as you can surmise by the way, my reaction to it. The way it was done was just strange, put it that way. But on the other hand, I was hitting some very, very hard areas. I was getting into some of the most important parts of the research that I had done in the 17 years. And if I was wrong, I could get up on the air and make a fool of myself. And if I was right, it would stand to reason that somebody would say, we've had enough of that. And to top it off, I had written to my congressman to help me get some information that I wanted on the air, one of the areas I'm researching, and he wrote back May the 6th, and he said, I certainly agree with you that this matter bears investigation. The concerns which you have raised are quite serious ones and merit careful attention. I have consequently forwarded a request for biographical information on Fritz Kramer to the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress, and I'll let you know when I receive a response to my request. Now, that was May the 6th, and the Library of Congress could get that out in about 4 minutes on their computer. But I may be reaching to a congressman who agrees that this is a serious matter. I've reached this congressman and many others on the murder of the President of the United States. They never responded and said that was serious. I reached them on the murder of a senator who wanted to be President of the United States, and they never thought that was serious. And many issues and problems of murders and Watergates or the Dorothy Hunt plane crash, they have ignored. So I believe when I get a response from somebody who goes to the Congressional Library to pursue it and agrees that it is quite a serious issue that I've raised, that this is even more important than all the other things I've studied, and if it is important, then you can expect that they don't want me to go much further on it or don't want me to talk about it on the air. I'm going to put aside many of the news articles of the week, except three that I want to mention to you, and then get into an article that is the most important article I've read in a long, long time, and I want to share it with you, even if it takes 2 weeks to do, and put aside some of the things like the silly Hinckley trial and a lot of the other articles that we'll get caught up with. There was one story, furor boils over slip of tongue, and that has to do with J. Peter Grace. That's the business partner of Otto Ambros, who designed the Zyklon B for IG Farb and the chemical that was used for extermination at Auschwitz. And I mentioned before, designed the slave labor at Auschwitz for the rubber factories for Adolf Hitler. J. Peter Grace has been a long partner of Otto Ambros, the war criminal of World War II, and he was appointed to this distinguished commission of Ronald Reagan's on how to cut domestic budgets. And of course, when he was in Dallas, he was opening his mouth over the food stamp program. Remember, I told you he'd start hitting the poor. He wouldn't cut vacations of the president, such as $1 million to go to Barbados for 1 week, but he was making remarks about the food stamp being the subsidy for Puerto Ricans in New York. That's they live all of them live off the food stamps. That's J. Peter Grace, and I'll get back to him more, but when he opens his mouth and begins to cut budgets, you see, he's going to cut them from the people that he's imported in here to do slave labor, and if they can't get a job in the garment factories or elsewhere, and they're getting the food stamps after they're brought in, those are the people that these Nazis attack, the poor minorities who have nobody to defend them, instead of hitting the people like William French Smith, who are getting these huge tax write-offs and big salaries and concealing large amounts of money. Another article this week in the paper that again relates to the important story I want to share with you is the Pentagon's strategy for a lengthy war, and it has to do with studies of President Reagan's National Security Advisor William P. Clark and the plans for the war, how if we decide to strike against the Soviet Union, will hit their allies such as Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea, that the nuclear strategy will be known as decapitation, and they'll strike Soviet political and military leaders and their communication lines, and will arm and assist China in an effort to keep the Soviet forces busy off the China border, and will have a special operations, guerrilla warfare, sabotage, psychological warfare going on at the same time, and space would have to be exploited for American military needs. This is our National Security Council head, William P. Clark, and the plans for a lengthy war, I guess almost on every area of the globe, that they've earmarked, and they'll fight it all at one time. Can you imagine what this is? What a big bang that's going to be. And then the story of the Pope being in England and meeting with the Anglican leaders and working for reconciliations and ecclesiastical unity. And the Joint Catholic Anglican Commission was completing 10 years of work, and they're going to issue a report. The only major obstacles to their agreements are the papal infallibility and the papal claim to primacy over all Christians. And they said, even though this is what the Vatican wants, it need not stand in the way of unity. Papal infallibility and papal claim to primacy over all Christians, and that's what the Vatican wants, and I think that's pretty well spelled out. I think the meeting of the Pope with the Anglican Church there is as important as the meeting in 1947, in August 1947, when President Truman sent messages to Pope Pius XII and guaranteed them that the U.S. would help the Catholic Church and all the forces striving for a moral world. Truman was busy in 1947 assuring Father Walsh, the vice president of Georgetown University, that the United States would combine with the Vatican, and this was described in a book as a very important step of the United States to link with the Vatican in policies. Father Welsh had claimed that the Russians wanted war and that we should get the Vatican ideas put to work. The aim of his campaign, Father Walsh, on the instruction of the Vatican, was to press the United States to introduce compulsory conscription for the oncoming American-Russian war. The last few weeks I've been sharing information that I've seen in print from Admiral Byrd now to the Vatican, to Georgetown University, dated back to 1946, 1947, that there would be conscription for the oncoming war. And after a year of Father Walsh from Georgetown working with President Truman, who was in office just a short time, there was a quasi-declaration of a Vatican-American war front, which sprung up in the United States, and the Pope and the American president exchanged letters. This is from a book, The Dollar and the Vatican, by Ivro Manhattan, and the rapprochement that was made of Harry Truman with the Vatican was a breaking ground on the admission or the description of the necessity for World War III. And now we have the Pope with the Anglican Church, and they want to combine their energies for what they call peace, which means peace without Russia. Now, the article that I do want to spend time with and the implications of these stories that I gave in the news is related to this article, is called The Men Behind the Counter-Reformation. And this article was written by Kevin Coogan, Coogin, Kevin Coogan, and it was reprinted in Jonathan Marshall's newsletter, March 31st, 1982. And on the printed sheet with this tape, I'll give you the information. This article is 4.5 pages long and 2 pages of footnotes, and I already wrote it down into 37 pages of subjects that he brought up in that one article. It reminds me of the 3 articles that I did in The Realist, where every sentence could be extended to a paragraph to explain what the sentence meant. This Kevin Coogan is a great researcher. He hits right on the facts, and I haven't seen anyone like him since Jeff Gerth wrote his article on organized crime and Richard Nixon and those interconnecting links a long time ago. That was published at the time of Watergate. We have to get in touch with Kevin Coogan, and I'm going to try to do that because it is a brilliant article. Now, the reason he calls it the Counter-Reformation, he has several quotations in this article. One is an interview in the Los Angeles Times of Robert Scheer, November 1981, that was just a few months ago, with Richard Perle, P-E-R-L-E, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and also chairman of a high level of NATO. And this military man for the United States, Richard Perle, was complaining about the anti-war movements in Europe, and he launched this massive attack against the European anti-war movement, and you know how much they love it at home. And he said in the LA Times, this is a project of Protestant angst, A-N-G-S-T. And he gave an example of the opposite of the Protestant thinking, such as Portugal or Spain or Italy, where you get a different attitude. And this article, according to Mr. Coogan, says that a new counter-reformation is sweeping Europe, such as took place years ago, many years ago, and it's sweeping the United States, and it has the full support of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. That's why she invited the Pope to the Anglican Church, and the Pope's visit to England was part of this movement with the Church and Archbishop Runkle. And the whole section of the Anglican Church will capitulate to Rome. This is what he's saying in this article, that soon Catholics who support economic reforms and limit nuclear war will be called heretics, that they'll disassociate themselves from the other part of the church, and the church will call them heretics because, going back to Father Walsh, who was the man who put Senator Joe McCarthy into power, that Father Walsh was the man behind McCarthy. He was pushing for atomic bombs from the Vatican, was pushing for them in 1946-47. Father Drinnan was removed from Congress. He was anti-Nixon and had a part in the Watergate. He was driven out by the Pope, who said that you can't be political and be in Congress, but that's because he was a liberal and not a warmonger that he made him resign from Congress. Now, a Professor Gedda, G-E-D-D-A, wrote a book that was published by Stanford Press in 1976. It's called Catholic Action in Italy, The Sociology of a Sponsored Organization. This Gedda incidentally backed Lyndon LaRouche for president. But Professor Gedda explains in his book that 4 centuries ago, when the Reformation came along, we had Protestantism, which means religious liberalism. And after the French Revolution, when they got rid of the monarchy, they had a self-styled liberty, which isn't good for people. It gives you license to do anything you want. So in his book, he criticizes early romantic socialism of the last century and says that romantic socialism leads to dictatorship, such as freedom of thinking. Karl Marx leads to the revolution in Russia and throwing out the church and the monarchy. And you can't have this kind of thinking. He says this is fatal logic. When you transform your thoughts, you transform social conditions. And now today, communism has descended from the Protestant Revolution. So that this particular Catholic thinker, is again published by Stanford University, thinks that when you're liberal, you end up with the Protestants. And in order to have a strong society, you have to get back to Catholicism. Now, this particular Professor Gaeta is one of the members of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. It's long overdue, I suppose, for me to talk about the Knights of Malta, the SMOM, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. And that's what this article is about. The church has its religious branch, and since for the past 1,000 years, the Catholic Vatican Church has had its military army with their loyalty to the Vatican, and they carried on the Inquisition and the Crusades, and the military group have been very strong side by side with the religious group for 1,000 years to defend the Catholic Church. And now they believe that the Reformation brought Protestantism, which brought all this liberalism, and if you don't have a war, you can't get the commies out. So they're ready to arm with the atomic bombs and so forth, and the military branch must come in and defend the Vatican. And so the Knights of Malta is the group that has been organized for this purpose. Now, I might tell you right now who are some of the members of the Knights of Malta, and almost every single one that he mentions just in this 4-page article has some tentacles, let's not say to all the assassinations, let's say Permindex and the John Kennedy assassination. And here are some of the members. I'll just give you their names and then go back to the article in the order that he talks about them. One is James Angleton, the head of the counterintelligence of our Central Intelligence Agency, who is in charge of the Vatican for the CIA and for Israel for the CIA, and worked with Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence. He's part of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta of the Vatican Army. Robert Ablanev, I'll take these in alphabetical order. Ablanev is the man who has the home down off of Florida. When Richard Nixon needed help at the time, they were setting up Alger Hiss. They'd fly him down there, Bibi Rabosa, to Ablanev's place, and this is where he was many times when he was president of the United States. This is the man that put up money for San Clemente, for Richard Nixon's home. This man is not seen very much. I looked him up in Who's Who and didn't even see him in there, although he's quite wealthy with his aerospray cans. But he's a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta and obviously was the control of Richard Nixon for many years. Richard Allen was in Germany for several years and then went to Atlanta, Georgia for 6 months. And about a half a year ago, I did tapes on Richard Allen because he came right up to the Georgetown Center for Strategic Studies and the University of Georgetown to set up this far right-wing think tank that would put Ronald Reagan into power and get ready for the warfare state. Richard Allen was an integral part of the German money that went. He was in Atlanta, and I said at the time, how could a history professor from assistant professor from Atlanta who didn't even get his doctor's degree in Germany bring this money to Georgetown? So evidently the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, that is heavily concentrated in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., has direct links to Richard Allen, who was former Security Council director. He's out in the national security, but very close to Robert Vesco and other persons. I don't want to get too far off on Allen now. William Buckley formed Young Americans for Freedom, has National Review. The YAF brought in a team from Munich, Germany, who were in the Dallas-Fort Worth area when John Kennedy was assassinated and were involved in that. And of course, he's heavily involved in Watergate and integral part of the Bay of Pigs and counter espionage and espionage for years. He's a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. James Buckley, who is our roving ambassador and working now with the National Security Council, and Mr. Clark, a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. The Bilderbergers were set up. The Prince Bernhard, by a member of the Vatican, who got the money and the financing to get Bernhard to be the head of the Bilderbergers. This was set up by a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. William Casey, the CIA director who I said was involved with Operation Sunrise. Last week I mentioned the selling out of America. He's our CIA director now. Whose allegiance does he take, the United States or the Vatican? He is a member of this. He worked with William Donovan in the OSS. Casey worked with Reinhard Gehlen. He brought Lucky Luciano and organized crime in from Sicily and Milan and Palermo, the Italian crime syndicate, into what became the Central Intelligence Agency. William Casey is a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. CIA officials involved, just in this one 4-page article: William Casey, William Donovan, Reinhard Gehlen, James Angleton, and John McCone. Well, Bill Donovan, they're going to give a Donovan Award for the Knights of Malta. Donovan was put on the American Cancer Society in 1946 by Elmer Bopst. Donovan was head of the OSS that became the CIA. Elmer Bopst was the cover for Otto von Bolschwing, Adolf Eichmann's superior, and Donovan was working with Elmer Bopst, he created the presidency of Richard Nixon and catapulted him into office. Donovan and Bopst were working together from 1946, when the war was over, the American Cancer Society. Peter M. Flanagan, a Nixon aide, is a member of this Sovereign Military Order of Malta. I emphasize the military because I'm not talking about Catholics who are doing good work. I'm not talking about Catholics who are not military, the true religious believers. I'm talking about the military branch that is willing to wage World War III and wants to combine with the Anglican Church and take it over, that has a grand design and will use the military means, and is using the top Nazis from Hitler's entire regime and coordinating them into our intelligence community. All of them are members of this organization. Flanagan works for the intelligence division of J. Peter Grace, the fellow I mentioned who was putting down the Puerto Ricans and the food stamps, and he was part of the ad hoc committee that was behind the murder of Allende in Chile. That's Peter Flanagan. Georgetown Center for Strategic Studies is directly linked to this group. It's set up for the military branch of the Vatican and the Catholic Church, and Center for Strategic and International Studies means planning World War III. Reinhard Gehlen was awarded the Knights of Malta immediately after World War II. It wasn't over a year. I have the date when he became one of 3 to get the highest honors of Knights of Malta. There's different degrees. Reinhard Gehlen was Hitler's chief of intelligence, Eastern Division, and then moved west and came to this country with Alan Dulles. John Foster Dulles' son worked with this group and with the church, along with Martin Bormann. The two of them were together and left the country, went to South America. Reinhard Gehlen got one of the highest honors, though evidently these people didn't think that Hitler and Nazi Germany and those 600 concentration camps, incidentally, I was reading a figure there's 600. There wasn't just Auschwitz or a few that you think of that are better known. Baron Hilton of the Hilton Hotels, a member of this Sovereign Military Order. Lee Iacocca, who was with Ford Motor Company. Now, Ford has always published violent anti-Semitic literature. When Marina Oswald first came to the United States in June '62, she was met by Colonel Lawrence Orloff, who then went up to Henry Ford in Michigan. She was meeting with him, and as soon as John Kennedy was murdered, 2 days later, the limousine was sent up to Dearborn, Michigan, where it is today. It was reupholstered for a while for LBJ, but any area where there were bullet holes in the metal were covered up, And when it was sent to Michigan, Lee Iacocca was one of the heads working for Ford Motor Company. And I believe, I looked up Who's Who in America, and he's been at the Ford for a long, long time. The car that John Kennedy was in was sent up to the Ford Motor Company. Lee Iacocca, who then went to Chrysler, and that's beginning to go bankrupt, or has gone bankrupt, on the verge of hanging in there, member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Joseph P. Kennedy was a member of this military gang, but Joseph P. Kennedy was very Nazi, and in this article they mentioned that the mistake his son John made, according to a white Russian who had an interview about, was that John was too independent and tried to disassociate himself from the Catholic group. John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy were never members of it, but their Nazi father, Joe Kennedy, was a member of the military branch, the Sovereign military branch, and James Ling is a member. He's not written up in Who's Who, but this is Ling Voigt, the defense people, and I'm sure there must be another volume where I can get a bio on Ling because the name is familiar. Father Walsh, of course, who was the man who created Senator Joe McCarthy so that they could release the prisoners at Malmedy, the Nazis that had worked with Hitler in the East and West and Middle and all over the globe, known killers who massacred Americans and other people. McCarthy was put in by Father Walsh, and Georgetown clique, again, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and Spyro Skouras was a member. Now, these names are just in one article. Imagine a 4-page article, and details, quite a few details about this organization, and there's not very much written. There is some, but if we look for it, it's there. It's just that we've never realized, I'm sure, the importance of this, and it's just beginning to come in, because these are the people that have killed John Kennedy to make Richard Nixon president of the United States when he couldn't win against him, killed Robert Kennedy through the Permindex. They're all linked to the Permindex, the Torbett document, that book that's been out for 10 years. These people are all connected to the Watergate, the dirty tricks, the assassination teams, even to the John Lennon assassination. I'll get to that, if not this week, next week. There's connecting links, because a member of the Knights of Malta, a very strong man in this organization, was behind Strom Thurmond. And Strom Thurmond, of course, was meeting with people who he wanted John Lennon deported, but was meeting with people who had direct links to the murder of John Lennon with Mark David Chapman. And also this person from the Knights of Malta works with Larry McDonald down in DeKalb County, Georgia. DeKalb is where Mark David Chapman came from. This group is a who's who of assassination team members, although they're not identified as such in this 4-page article, but I have many files and books on each one of these, except with the exception of one or two. Michael Sindona, of course, was a member of this organization, and there's a reference in the footnotes of this one article that the P2 scandal in Italy, where the Italian government was going to be turned into a military dictatorship, such as Hitler and Mussolini had, and was just stopped by a fluke. They referred to it as the Masonic event, but it wasn't just Masonic. It had to do with the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and the top people involved are members of that organization. John Volpe, who was a cabinet member in the United States and former ambassador to Italy. Italy, of course, this is the headquarters of the Knights of Malta. And Werner Walters. Walters is described as one of the most notorious and vicious members, and he is the fellow who engineered the overthrow of Brazil in 1964, and that happened 1 year after John Kennedy was murdered. Vernon Walters is our roving ambassador to Argentina, to Morocco, to El Salvador, wherever there's trouble, and the trouble goes far right, and there's bloodbaths and coups. That's Vernon Walters. He was acting CIA director at the time of Watergate. He was involved in the direct links to Nazis down in Chile when Allende was murdered and when Orlando Letelier was murdered. That was Vernon Walters' contacts at the time with Nazis. I'd mentioned them on other programs. So these are a few names just mentioned in this one article that really covers a whole era of the organization, such as the Ford Company. Oh yes, I forgot. the, one of the most important members of Knights of Malta, and his organization is J. Peter Grace. 8 people on his board, and that's the partner of I.G. Farb and Otto Ambrose. 8 people on the board of the Grace Corporation are members of the Knights of Malta, and also interlocking bank in New York City. They trade off the directorships, and then the Flick group that were prosecuted and named in Nazi Germany and are very successful now, the Flick Steel, they bought 31% of the Grace Company, the Nazis that are back in business over in Germany. J. Peter Grace is a member of the Knight of Malta, the sovereign military order of Malta, not just member of the Catholic Church. So you can see how important this is. On the other side of this tape now, I'll turn it over. We'll do some more on the men behind the Counter-Reformation. This is May Brussell in Carmel, and I'm discussing an article published by Jonathan Marshall. The author is Kevin Coogan, Coogan, The Men Behind the Counter-Reformation. There's one other name that I forgot to share with you that is in this article, a member of the Sovereign Military Knights of Malta, and that's John McCone. He was CIA director at the time John Kennedy was assassinated and assisted the Warren Commission to conceal the Nazi connections to the Kennedy assassination, and then he was working for ITT at the time Allende was murdered, and now he's working for Bechtel Corporation along with Caspar Weinberger and the warmongers who can't get enough instruments for war that have been continuing since 1946-47, getting ready for this World War III. Now, this article is particularly important, and I want to mention the importance in light of some of the things that I have said and have not said on these broadcasts for a long time. And whenever there's elections coming up or discussions on who runs the world, people say, what do you think of the Council of Foreign Relations? What do you think of the Trilateral Committee? Why don't you talk about the Trilateral? And those of you who have subscribed to these tapes and know me know that I have done very little on the Trilateral or the Council of Foreign Relations, because my answer has always been very pat to these people. Why are you worried about Nelson and David Rockefeller and not about the Hoover Institute and not about Reinhard Gehlen and not about Project Paperclip? And where do the Nazis fit into this? And also, if there is a one world, and Odessa is part of that one world, Hitler's organization, if Hitler wanted a 1,000-year Reich, why aren't you addressing yourself to 2 power groups, struggling for the same thing? Now they keep acting as if Nelson Rockefeller still wants to control the world, and he's been in his coffin a while. In fact, 3 of the Rockefeller brothers have had an early demise, and the idea of turning the world to the KGB or the communists is part of this attack against the Protestant groups by the very strong military Catholics to break down the English Protestant tradition. Lyndon LaRoche, as I say, who works with these people from Solidarity, always is saying the British are taking over, the British control the world is going, communist, and the British want to control us. What they're trying to do is to break down the Protestantism of the Council of Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission. Not that they're perfect, not that the banks didn't even put in Adolf Hitler. They did, and Allen Dulles worked for them. But Allen Dulles is dead, and John Foster Dulles is dead, and so is Nelson Rockefeller. And this gang that have been running the military branch for 1,000 years are very much alive. They're well financed, and when you read this list, like William and James Buckley and William Casey and James Angleton and Mr. Iacocca and Reinhard Gehlen, he's passed, but all of his agents are around, and Vernon Walters and John McCone, they're all in power today. They're making all the decisions today. And they're making the decisions of where we're going to die and when we're going to die and how we die and how we're going to pay for it and how we're going to have to sacrifice for this war. This is a holy war. I referred to the Haig describes himself as the vicar of Washington with his Jesuit priest brother. He picture of on Time magazine when Reagan was shot as the vicar of Washington. He refers to himself as that, and their crusade to have a war against Russia is a holy war. Russia has thrown the church out for all purposes, and this is a crusade, and they will use every country and every area where people are striving to exist and take care of their needs in order to make that war against Russia. They're hell-bent on it. And that's why I've never really sided with those people attacking the Eastern Seaboard organizations as being the sum total of the problem. The problem goes deeper, and it certainly has to do with the members of the military branch of the Vatican who are running the United States today. Now, I'll refer to a few specifics of this article, and as I say, it may take 1 or 2 weeks to share with you, but it's so important, and he mentions these various names. James Angleton was taken into this organization, which existed long before World War I and II. It went on, as I say, for 1,000 years. But as soon as the war was over, we incorporated Hitler's SS men, the Gestapo, into our government and began the intelligence service. It was to become the CIA. So the war was over May 8th, 1945, and December the 27th, 1946, James Angleton, who had so much to do with the Middle East and the Palestine and Vatican, became a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and he was awarded a high honor, one of the highest honors that they had for whatever he had done. I know what he did during World War II. So Angleton, after the OSS, and working with Hitler's intelligence and William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, became a high CIA official, and he was the person that recommended that the United States tax dollar be sent to Luigi Gedda for Catholic action. James Angleton headed the Vatican desk. Now, it's Mr. Gedda who recently, Gedda, Luigi Gedda, he's the one who recently was talking about the need for a tightening up the liberalism of the church, and getting the Protestant system leads to dictatorship, such as the communists. He is violently anti-communist, and it was Angleton who wanted tax dollars to fund his publication or group called Catholic Action. This was 1946 when James Angleton was brought into the group. Reinhard Gehlen, November 17, 1948, 2 years later, became a member of the Knight of Malta, and he got the highest award in preparation for setting up the Cold War, I suppose, with Senator Joe McCarthy and dividing the Americans against each other. He was head of Hitler's intelligence, chief of the Eastern Division, and described as a linchpin of the Allen Dulles CIA connections when the CIA was formed. And he was in the Pentagon, of course, within months when the war was over, and working with Allen Dulles. Now, the year that he got this award, 1948, the Nazis were getting together, being ready to be released in the jails in Europe and to get out. Otto Skorzeny soon would be out to set up the Odessa. Reinhard Gehlen's brother is a member of this organization. He was secretary to the head of the state of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the brother of Reinhard Gehlen. His alias is Count Thun, Thun, Hehenstein. I can't pronounce that. He has a German name. The code name is Don Giovanni, the Italian name, based in Rome. This is the brother of Reinhard Gehlen, secretary to the head of the state of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. William F. Buckley, he describes in this article, wearing black capes, white Maltese crosses, and swords, swore the oath to defend the Holy Mother Church. Now, these people are American public officials used for public broadcasting, the firing line, and writing many books. In fact, William Buckley wrote a book on the Beatles in 1968. He seemed to be an expert on the Beatles. Buckley gets in his black cape and gets inaugurated into this organization. James Buckley, his brother, is high up in the National Security Council, And as I say, they're closely affiliated with the Georgetown Institute, the Strategic Studies. Richard Allen was to be joining and funding after his 2 years in Germany. William Clark, the National Security Advisor, he is written up in this article as a right-wing Catholic. He was appointed by Ronald Reagan to the Supreme Court in California earlier. He wasn't a lawyer. He was the first non-lawyer, I believe, to the California Supreme Court. And February the 5th, 1980, in the New Statesman, there was an article on Clark, the master of double cross, and it said Clark is a fervent conservative Catholic in the traditional mold. The Master of Double Cross by Mary McGrory. That was in 1980. And General Walters, the brains behind the 1964 coup in Brazil. The details of his role, some of it is in the book Secret Missions, his devout Catholicism. And as I say, in 1964, after the coup in Brazil, the organization came out for religion and family, that moral group that I mentioned several weeks ago on this program that surfaces now in Argentina, the same organization, both set up, I suppose, by Vernon Walters and the CIA in the Vatican. They have the same literature and the same name, and he was down in Brazil. And of course, down in Brazil, a little while later would come Jim Jones and his gang, affiliated in Belo Horizonte with the CIA. Alexander Haig's brother is a close link to this group, the Georgetown group, the Center for Strategic Studies. And out of there comes Jean Kirkpatrick, who is having a fight with Alexander Haig now because she's so pro-Argentinian and anti-British, and they're having open fights, and Haig is trying to do a balancing act because he plays both roles. NATO chief with his NATO alliances, Delisio Gelli, caught in that scandal, that Vatican P2 scandal in Italy in May 1981. When that scandal was just breaking down was the time when the Pope was shot, and of course he has strong links to Michael Sindona and Pope Paul VI, Montini. So I said at the time that one of the motives for shooting him might have been his links to them and to silence them because of that scandal that was breaking in Italy. The strategy, the church strategy, is planned at Georgetown at the Center for Strategic Studies, and they have total control of Ronald Reagan and his foreign policy. The Knights of Malta is described in this article as a war-making machine. They are seriously prepared for the brinkmanship game. Part of the structure is the notion of a holy crusade for the Catholic order. That's why I mentioned earlier on this broadcast that William P. Clark, part of the military branch of the Knights of Malta, is head of our National Security Council. And I pose the question, is it national security that we are fighting for? Do we have to arm China to keep the Soviet Union busy with the borders tied down, as they said today? Do we have to have the space exploited for American military needs? Do we have to have warships over in the Persian Gulf, or do we have to attack and strike again Vietnam, North Korea, and Cuba, and these various countries? William Clark is our National Security Advisor as of just today, this week, May 31st, May 30th, 1982. He has his strategy for a lengthy war. We're going into maybe a 100-year war, and people think, well, if we have a war, the bomb will drop everybody fast, and that will be it. It didn't happen that way before, and it won't happen that way again. There will be a lot of pain in a lot of places. And the desire for war is published in book after book. As I say, Father Walsh from Georgetown, 1947, with Harry Truman planning World War III. That was 1947. This is 1982. Mr. Clark from the same military arm of the Vatican, planning the war, still spreading it out. The book Real Lace, the story Stephen Birmingham wrote about the Knights of Malta, and I'll do more later in case you don't have that book, about the Boston members of the Knights of Malta and the war-making machine. They wanted a hot war and a cold war going at the same time, and Senator Joe McCarthy was the perfect person for witch hunting in the United States. The man behind him, that Walsh, Father Walsh, was the one who directed him. He briefed him Joe McCarthy, and launched his career in 1946. And he also helped J. Edgar Hoover, who was working with Interpol and the Nazis in Germany. Father Walsh was the man behind J. Edgar Hoover, and we know what kind of a holy war against so-called communists were going on this country. Now, he was the one, as a member of the Sovereign Order, the military order, that was feeding him stories of communists in the State Department. They came right out of Georgetown University and right out of the Vatican to J. Edgar Hoover. And Father Walsh, being a violent anti-communist, went to Germany and debriefed a certain Major General Karl Haushofer, Haushofer, known as the world's best-known geopolitician. Now, Germany lost the war, and they couldn't figure out things except for mass slaughters and deaths, how to get their act together, but he was still the greatest. So Father Walsh goes to debrief him. It's interesting, Henry Kissinger's over there in the Bulge, and then debriefing the SS, Gestapo, and the Skorzeny team, and then Father Walsh, a violent anti-communist, goes to debrief this Major General Karl Haushofer. General Haushofer, this great geopolitician, had a lot to say to Father Walsh from Georgetown, and then he comes home and funds Joe McCarthy, who then gets the top Nazis out of the prison in Dachau, who were supposed to be in there for life or get death sentence. So we have the debriefings going on by German Henry Kissinger, who's brought back via Fritz Kramer after World War II, and then we have Father Walsh over there too. Debriefing Nazis. Can you imagine what a riot that was with these guys, Kissinger and Walsh, because Kissinger was the head of our National Security Council, bloodbath in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and I keep saying the Middle East, and spreading his virus. Even the Allende murder that he ordered for ITT and the CIA, and if you see the movie Missing, it mentions Henry Kissinger and it mentions Nazis in that movie. And this gang were over there, in quotes, debriefing these Nazis and then coming back, I guess, with plenty to set up their organizations and getting ready for our government's Cold War that took place. Father Walsh was, as I say, the genius behind feeding the State Department and J. Edgar Hoover, and the damage that J. Edgar Hoover did just goes on and on. Now, their pet organization that they always wanted to attack, the Georgetown Institute, their policy studies, they would go after the other think tank in Washington called the Institute for Policy Studies. The Georgetown group would go after them and call them KGB and link them to communists like they linked the Protestant Nelson Rockefeller, David Rockefeller to the KGB all the time. The Institute of Policy Studies was supposed to be KGB, and this was the Atlantic faction. This was the American and British intelligence group. The Vatican and the Italian members of our administration, the military order, the Vatican Army, have been fighting the American and British intelligence. And that makes sense if you realize how much they attacked the British and how much they attacked particularly the think tanks of the Northeast. Very often people have described a cowboy Indian war or broke the United States up into geographic areas. Kirkpatrick did this. Kirkpatrick Sales did a book on that. I have it, I forget the title of it, was on the Cowboys and Yankees, Cowboys and Indians. It isn't that simple. Maybe the real story should be broken down into the Vatican versus the Anglican, because this anti-Reformation thing is going on in speeches that the anti-war people are part of the Protestant group. This is coming out right now in the Los Angeles Times very openly. And if everybody making policy in Washington for the past 15 years or 20 years, like John McCone and Vernon Walters and William Casey, they're all in power now, and William Buckley and James Buckley and James Angleton, and they all go back to Lee and Marina Oswald, to George Bornschild, to the murder of Kennedy, to put Richard Nixon in office, who was instrumental in bringing Nazis to this country. It may be more than just an east, west, north, south. It obviously and always was something different, and I never fell for that either. I never fell for the simplistic explanation of certain institutions as against others that were appearing everywhere in my studies. And this one article that just came out by Kevin Coogan that Jonathan Marshall got out in his newsletter makes more sense by identifying who belongs to this group and who's made our policy since before World War II was over, started making the policy actually in 1943 with the OSS and the SS. That's Hitler's Gestapo and Mr. Wolf sitting in Bern, Switzerland with Allen Dulles, and he had the American intelligence set up by Winston Churchill during the war and Hitler's intelligence simultaneously, and all linked to the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the military branch of the Vatican. This group, the Galen group, hated the British intelligence. They hated them even though they brought them to this country. They were more with the Americans than the British. And the book, The Bormann Brotherhood, William Stevenson describes how Galen hated Willy Brandt, and the German socialists hated socialists all along. The division of the people running this country today makes more sense if you break it into Protestant versus the Catholic versus the Protestant than, as I say, you do geographical or areas or any other way. Now, Galen is instrumental in setting his agents all over the world, and Galen is honored by this organization as soon as the war is over as a part of a church approval. He is incorporated into the military arm of the Vatican Church. I mean, nothing that happened in Italy or Germany or Belgium or France matters, or Russia. All these deaths, and Galen had planned immediately after the war. I keep quoting over and over my favorite sentence in his book, the book that Kukridge wrote on him, how immediately he was going to starve 40 million or 50 million and make the other 40 million, I don't remember which the proportion was, I should know it by now, make them into slave labor. Galen was embraced for this, and this is where we're heading when you see 20 or 30 million starving in Africa in these drought areas. They're being eliminated. That's what Galen wanted, and that's what we're getting. And incidentally, J. Peter Grace, a member of this sovereign military group, was the founder of the Freedom from Hunger organization. And I don't want to get too far afield, but I looked up Werner Erhard, Mr. Rosenberg, who gave himself 2 German names, and he began his Est group in San Francisco with money from a woman, an organization from Georgetown University, and another one from Holland, where the Bilderberger was set up by the Knights of Malta. So the people behind Werner Erhard, J. Peter Grace with his genocidal policies, Reinhard Galen with his genocidal policies, were embraced by what you call a church. Well, should a church have a religious function or a military function? And will they bring us on to 100 years war? Will they bring us into a war that just completely destroys the world? Are you ready for this? Are you, if you're a Catholic, do you like it? If you're a Protestant, what do you think of this? What do you think about this article on the Reformation and the role that the Vatican has in Ronald Reagan's administration? What do you think? I think it's terrible. Now, this article says that there's a real power struggle going on with the Vatican versus the Protestant. And he describes the home base at Georgetown Institute. Now, a book was just put out, and it's available. Tom Davis has it at Research up in Capitola, box 1107, in Aptos, rather, California. I'll put the address on the sheet again. Professor Carol Quigley has written a book called Tragedy and Hope, where he attacks the British Round Table and the Council of Foreign Relations. Well, Quigley was a member of the Birch Society, and he's part of the Catholic right, the extreme Catholic right. And again, Mr. H.L. Hunt and Warren Carroll of the CIA were involved in the death of John Kennedy and Jack Ruby's contacts with them and the Republic National Bank and the Young Americans for Freedom in that area that were brought by William Buckley from Germany down to Dallas. The names I'm mentioning are not removed from the period that I studied a long time ago, starting over 17 years ago, on who killed John Kennedy. There's another book that I'll put on the sheet for you in case you're interested in getting it, called The Knights Templar by Stephen Howarth. Athenian Press just printed it. I haven't read it yet. It's on the Knights of Malta. But Mr. Quigley's book, Harold Quigley's book, The Anglo-American Establishment, The Conspiracy from Rhodes, at Cecil Rhodes, to Cliveden. It's published by Books in Focus. Now, they're attacking the British system, see, and it's coming out of the military group of the Vatican that is publishing this to break down the British and make you mistrust them, while the Vatican wants, as I say, this holy war. Now, in 1940s, in middle 1940s or late 1940s, when the war was over, there was the start of what they called an ecumenical movement to combine the Anglican Church with the Catholic Church, except, as it said in the newspaper this week, what the Pope wants is a joint Catholic-Anglican commission, but they want papal infallibility and papal claim to primacy over all Christians. And so when the war was over in the late 40s, a man named Joseph Bittinger, Bittinger, founded the Bilderberger Group. This was to combine and then take them over. Then the Catholics would take them over. And Prince Bernhard of I.G. Farben and Hitler's SS youth group, who, in quotes, headed the Dutch resistance during the war and became the titular head and the head of this group, the Bilderberger Society. It was founded by a member of the military branch of the Vatican, Mr. Joseph Bettinger. He was in direct contact, Bettinger, with Luigi Gedda, the first man that I quoted on the beginning of this tape, when they were ordained in Knights of Malta. So this Bettinger was very important as a military member of the Vatican, and then selected Prince Bernhard to head up the Bilderbergers. And that's where I said several weeks ago they meet annually to decide who will get a piece of the pie and who will survive and where will the world leaders be and how can they hold the resources and the labor of the world in their hands. Now, this is not a nice group. These people will kill John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy or Salvador Allende. They'll kill other Catholics because this is a far fascist group. It's distinguished from the people, as I say, going about doing their things or trying to make social improvement. They'll kill them right away. There's a book called Memoirs of an Eminence Grise, Grise, by John Pomian, Pomian. And it tells how Mr. Bettinger was in direct contact with Mr. Gedda when Gedda was getting his Knights of Malta award in the late 1940s, and the role of the Vatican Church in setting up the Bilderberger Group. Now, this group was directly linked to I.G. Farben, to Hitler, to the betrayal at Arnhem that stalled the war so that they could get their money out and begin refurbishing the 1,000-year Reich. Prince Bernhard was linked to $1 million payoff from Lockheed Corporation, married to Queen Juliana. She only had $600 million, so he needed $1 million more for his own little gaieties. I think we won't go into the details, taking place in Paris. But the Bilderberg Foundation, it was founded and started by Joseph Bettinger, and it began including Protestants and Catholics as ecumenical order created by a Baron Brankovan, Brancovan, a relative of an exiled king of Yugoslavia, and they received direct support of Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, and the group incorporated in the Netherlands and began this organization. It meets every year. When Gerald Ford was on the Warren Commission to investigate who killed John Kennedy, while he was actually covering up who killed the President of the United States, he was attending a Bilderberg meeting in Washington in 1964. He has the nerve to go to this international group made up of the top level of the Anglican and the Vatican and Prince Bernhard, when he returns back to the investigations to conceal all the Nazi and interlocking links of Angleton and Galen agents that killed John Kennedy. I always said many, many times on these tapes and radio broadcasts for years, until you get to the evidence in the Torbett document that came out in 1970, until you get the Reinhardt-Gehlen connections, you will never have the story of who killed John Kennedy. And many of the people whose names I mentioned tonight either were part of the murder or part of the cover-up, worked directly with the agents, and covered this up. So that is how Bilderberg got started. I'll do more next week. I have a lot on this organization, and it's terribly important. And the article that I've been speaking about this evening is The Men Behind the Counter-Reformation by Kevin Coogan. I will take more sections of that article. As I say, the article is only 4.5 pages, a short story with 2 pages of references, but every sentence gets more important as to what is happening today in the news, the stories of the war, the stories of the Pope's trips, the information about J. Peter Grace, and I'll do a lot of maybe the whole tape next week on the J. Peter Grace activities that are described just in this article. But I don't want to go too fast because he's hit upon something very basic about who is running our government, and is this a holy war? Are we going to get like the Crusade and Inquisition? And the Inquisition wasn't very nice, okay? Are we going to get into a holy war? Is that where Ronald Reagan is leading us, and is he directed by the military branch of the Vatican? In the meantime, this is May